It's safe to assume there's a lot of love for the DC animated movies. Statistically, the DC animated movies have done really well on my channel, and the general consensus going around is that the DC live action movies are just okay, but not great, that their animated movies are what the fans point to when they think DC in media. There's also the consensus that the Marvel live action movies are great, and the animated movies, well, there could be more to be desired. Today I wanted to dive into that, have a look at the Marvel animated movies one by one, and see how they stack up, why they feel a little empty, why most don't hit as hard as their competitors over at DC, and why they aren't being made anymore. It's very clear that I have a lot of love for the DC animated movies, but I'm also a realist. I've never been blinded by fandom. When I was young I used to love the prequels. In some ways they're still a lot of fun, but as I got older, as I developed critical thinking, it was abundantly clear that the original trilogy were superior films.
That's impossible!
But why? Why am I talking about Star Wars, especially in a Marvel related video? Well, it's to give you guys some context. I myself don't agree with the consensus on these two companies. I think both companies have their issues. Marvel's live action movies have lost their individual flair. They feel like chapters, not defined one and done movies anymore. Not like these Spidey movies of the early 2000s.
Pizza time.
Say what you will about the Raimi films, but at least they stand on their own. I'm not the first to notice this. Others have talked about the homogeneity of the color grading to make the universe all appear very samey, or the fact that they choose small malleable directors with no voice, so they fit into the cog of the wheel that is the Marvel machine, that they get their characters from A to B. Over at DC, I feel like their live action movies have left me underwhelmed. Self-important films that are borderline pretentious, movies that are fun but lackluster in scope, and the ones that have scope, genuine vision, have done really well, critically and financially. As for their animated movies, well, they started out really solid, spearheaded by Dwayne McDuffie, responsible for Justice League, Teen Titans, and Static Shock, with support from Brendan Vietti, who would go on to be one of the lead producers of Young Justice, and Lauren Montgomery, who worked on Voltron. These were the heydays of the DC animated movies, stories that felt cinematic, as if they could be on the big screen, especially films like Under the Red Hood, First Flight, and Wonder Woman. There was an effort and character put into these films, stories with an emotional backbone. With the passing of McDuffie in 2011, rest in peace, and Brandon and Lauren going to work on their shows, that would leave DC in a strange spot. New talent started to direct, Sam Liu, who would make some of my least favourite DC animated movies, Bad Blood, Throne of Atlantis, Batman vs Robin, and now Hush, and Jay Oliver, a storyboard artist for Man of Steel, who would go on to direct Justice League War and Dark, among others. Safe to say, if I were you, I'd be confused by now. How is this relevant information, especially to the Marvel animated movies? Well, this change explains the decline in quality with the animated movies over at DC. And here's the catch. Jay Oliver directed the Marvel animated movies, all of them except Planet Hulk. That one, Sam Liu directed. I'm not trying to bash these two guys, but it's abundantly clear that the talent that made the DC animated movies great in the first place is no longer there. I think there's a hint of irony that hardcore DC fans are willing to bash the Marvel animated movies when that very talent has taken over the DC animated movies since Flashpoint. Since 2011's Flashpoint, when the takeover began, we've seen a drop in budget for the films, which has led to stiffer animation, lazier composition, and shots that feel flat, scenes that feel empty. Just look at the detail of Flashpoint's Professor Zoom against the same zoom we get in Hell to Pay. There's a very clear difference in the quality of the design and the animation. Probably the most egregious offender is the shorter runtimes, leaving us with movies that don't allow us to dive into the characters in the way that we could before. A great example being Under the Red Hood. Now we get these very surface level movies, not like what it used to be with Doom or Crisis. So why talk about that bit of history? Why bring it up? Well, hopefully with that bit of context I've destroyed any bias for the DC animated movies. Hopefully now we can look at the Marvel animated movies as movies, without any preconception that they're worse just because they're Marvel. Hopefully now I've balanced the scales of fanboys that insist DC animated movies are some sort of holy grail, because lately they really haven't been. Enough about DC, let's take a look at the Marvel animated movies. First starting with the Invincible Iron Man. Starting with the positives, I enjoyed seeing Tony on his back leg, figuring out how to best utilize the suits, how to best defeat opponents that had him outnumbered. To me, putting Tony in a high-risk scenario, seeing him get beat up by forces he doesn't yet understand, was a lot more compelling than the prepared genius we're used to seeing. This is a Tony that is finding his footing, that is learning to be a hero, and seeing that hero flourish is a lot of fun. Visually, the movie is a lot more interesting than any of the newer animated movies I've seen. There's effort and detail put into the art design and the animation, with creative ways to introduce or display characters, whether it's showing a character through a reflection possession or hiding a body through the movement of an undead spirit. There's attention to detail here. No easy choices are made, and it shows. Safe to say the movie is a little vague. Because of the runtime, they focused on telling Tony's story, making that work, instead of world building. Little is said about the Mandarin's reign years ago. Little is said about the Marquelan rings, how its power works, where they originated, why there is only 5 and not 10. I'm not saying I wanted the movie bogged down in explanations or exposition, but a little more could be done to make the weight of the events we're seeing feel a little more immediate, a little more real. I think my central problem with this movie is its circumstances, or at least how they come about. Tony's character in this movie is heroic from start to finish, and lacks the defined character arc that 2008's Iron Man delivered so well. Sure, Tony starts out a little more suave and boastful, by the end becomes a little more sincere, but there's no tragic revelation that forces Tony to reinvent himself. There was no reason to create the suits. Instead, the sins of Tony's weapons are put on his father. It's his father's fault for letting weapons fall into the hands of the terrorists.
You loaded weapons onto the cargo jet for Rhodey, knowing I was against it. They got stolen and people died. Now they're blaming me for those deaths.
Rhodey needed protection. Military contracts are what built this company.
No, it started the company. I built it, and without a single weapon.
When Tony is captured, he creates the Mark I armor, as we'd expect, but later on we're then shown that he'd always had these suits, that Iron Man was not birthed in a cave with a box of scraps.
With a box of scraps!
I just said that Tony was always a hero. He was always going to be Iron Man? I guess it depends on how you read into it. To me, the Iron Man armor is a symbol of Tony's reinvention as a person, and this movie takes that away. We're told Tony always had his mother's heart.
Like my mother?
She hated the work I did, and she got you believing that weapons were...
How dare you blame her for any of this? She stood by you, Dad. She defended you.
So was he always destined to become a hero? Or was this telling of the Iron Man tale just a motiveless excuse to get Tony from A to B? Is this story contrived? Well, I'm somewhere in the middle. Moving on, we have Thor Tales of Asgard. Whilst the movie is an endearing, fun adventure, it's ultimately quite forgettable, especially the side characters, Volstagg, Hogun, and the other one. Outside of Thor and Loki, to a degree, most of the characters are not characters, they're plot devices to motivate our hero. Odin, Sif, the Frost Giants, they all just serve as motivation to push Thor in a direction, Sif coming the closest to having her own wants and desires, her own identity outside of the hero.
I just require your help.
No, I came here to get away from you.
The movie has some great moments of action, my favourite being Thor facing off against the villain of the film in complete darkness. Whilst these scenes are fun and a little tense, what they do great is reveal character. Thor chooses to spare the life of his friend turned enemy, and Loki, well, not so much. What these types of scenes do is tell us something about the nature of each character, to choose mercy over vengeance, or vice versa. Such choices really just hint at the future of these characters, what both men are destined to become, and in that way it's the film's strongest feature. I wish I had more to say on the movie, but it really is by the numbers. It's your standard Thor adventure. The novelty here is that we're seeing the origins to these characters. Outside of that, the movie doesn't have much to offer. So let's move on to a movie with potential, a movie that had a lot going for it, that wasted that potential. It's Doctor Strange. I'm talking about Doctor Strange. So, Doctor Strange, the Sorcerer Supreme. If I said to you, how would you like a Doctor Strange movie? With Mordo, Dormammu, some monsters and magic. Would you be keen? Well, yeah. Most likely. Who wouldn't? This film sort of squanders that potential. For some reason, this movie is radiating huge 2007's TMNT vibes. I don't know, maybe it's the monster hunting that's putting me off, or the self-serious tone. Okay, let's get into that. Without being a buzzkill, this movie is sort of devoid of fun and wonder. Its magic isn't mind-bending, it's just matter manipulation. There's no spells per se, just powers that are unlocked. It pretty much tells the similar tale to the 2016 film, but with less nuance and a whole lot less fun. Having no trouble rushing through scenes, being more concerned with a fast pace than being able to let the characters breathe. The movie is a hop, skip and a jump, and then it's done, with our characters bouncing from place to place. Sure, some movies benefit off of this structure, Star Wars being a great example. But for this movie, and having a significantly shorter runtime than a full-length feature film, well, it just makes it impossible to get attached to these characters before we see them dive headfirst into battle. I think the most disappointing thing about this try at Doctor Strange is its predictability. It took me 3 goes to watch this movie in full without falling asleep, and I fell asleep mainly because you can see where the story is going a mile away. As soon as we meet Mordo, regardless of our pre-existing knowledge of him as a villain, well, it's plainly obvious where his character is going to end up. He's the hard-ass warrior of a bunch of peacekeepers, his cold precision leading him down a path of jealousy and vengeance when he's outmatched by a new sorcerer.
That's quite enough, Mordo.
Probably my favourite of the Marvel animated movies is our next animated feature, Planet Hulk. Planet Hulk to me is by far the strongest entry on this list. It opens rather strong. The premise is defined. Simple. Hulk is too dangerous to be kept on Earth, so he's sent elsewhere. We see why he's dangerous. We see the anger, and that lands him on Sakaar, where the events of the film take place. Within the first 2.5 minutes, we're told everything we need to know. We're introduced to the Hulk, we're shown why he's sent away, we see the anger, and we're given the exposition on a savior that will liberate Sakaar. Just to repeat, that's just in the first 2 minutes. Here we get a gladiator-like movie as our heroes fight for their freedom. From the cameos of the Grand Master, Star-Lord, Gamora and a Skrull to the awesome score, the movie fires on all cylinders. There's an attention to detail here not found in the other Marvel animated movies, and that's really appreciated. I have to say the movie is quite impressive, especially the action. It's surprising and dramatic as characters will come hurtling out of nowhere. I find the ability to alter the source material to create a more streamlined narrative is a well-made change. Having it be Beta Ray Bill instead of the Surfer and cutting out a few characters streamlines the movie. Korg's origin now carries weight into his encounter with his brothers, and his encounter with Beta Ray Bill.
Who? The alien who drove us off that planet. You must have followed my ship through the portal.
Little things like that just help make the story much more tighter. To me, the best part of the movie is the characters. You'll love to hate the Red King, as he mirrors other cinematic baddies, Caesar, and a tinge of Lex Luthor. Lavin was a hero you'd expect to lead the team, as he has all the attributes of a great leader, but his death early on is a shocking surprise that motions Hulk into action, and by extension the rest of the events of the film. Outside of the Hulk, Kyra is the film's next lead. She doesn't feel like a supporting character, instead she shares the screen with the Hulk, matching him physically but also emotionally, as her heartbreaking backstory is made all the more tragic when she discovers her king was the one that instigated the events leading to her family's death. That he is not a savior as she thought, but a tyrant manipulating his image to the people of Sakaar.
The spikes have returned!
I know, I sent them.
You what?
Don't be so surprised. The spikes have always been my greatest weapon. They helped me find you, and now they'll rid this world of that green monster and his friends.
Whilst it was amazing that the movie gave Beta Ray Bill some much needed love, I will say the movie heavily relies on your pre-existing knowledge of Marvel to get through the story. The class system, the species are all sort of brushed past to keep focus on the characters. I feel as if we got an extra half an hour to world build to develop the planet our heroes inhabited outside the arena, well then the threat of the spikes, our connection to the people of Sakaar could have been just that much more invested. So when hell rains down on them a second time, we actually care. Next we have Ultimate Avengers. Based off the Ultimates comic from Marvel back in 2002, it sees a new interpretation of the Avengers' origin. Hank's a dick, Iron Man's a charming dick, Thor's very merry.
Asgardian mead, nectar of the gods.
Bruce is trying to get rid of the Hulk, Cap is adjusting to the new world. In a way, this story shares a lot of similarities to the 2012 Avengers movie we'd get some 6 years after the release of this film. Hulk fighting the Avengers, the Chitauri, and Black Nick Fury. Whilst the movie is promising with its fast-paced action, its voice talent, its smart dialogue.
Who's the chick with the hammer?
Whoever she is, I'm glad she's on our side.
It just doesn't feel like a movie. Instead, it feels like the start of something more interesting, like a better sequel, or a show that continued off this as the backbone. The movie feels like a grind to sit through, with characters playing the I don't want to be there card, but you know that they're going to come around because they're heroes.
Good to see you, Stark.
You're lucky. I had an opening in my schedule.
It's pretty much an hour-long slog to get our characters all into one place, to one giant action scene where the heroes learn to work together. to become a team. Whilst it has some standout scenes, the movie is quite empty in terms of heart, instead relying more on the stakes of the scenario to carry the movie. Moving on from Ultimate Avengers, we have its sequel, The Rise of the Black Panther. In a way, this is very much a continuation of the first, and in my opinion, I'd recommend to watch them together. Getting past the obligatory origin, the sequel is finally able to tell a story of these heroes on an adventure, and in some ways, specifically Steve, we're able to connect that story to his past. Vibranium is a big part of the story here, and so is its premier hero in all things Vibranium, the Black Panther, with the central conflict taking place in Wakanda this time round. Whilst Kleiser isn't much of a character, his Terminator-like presence is still threatening, and he provides quite a foil for Cap and T'Challa. I have to say I really enjoyed the final battle, feeling worthy of a movie-level conflict, and having the balls to kill off one of its heroes at its end.
I told you I could be the man you always wanted me to be.
Safe to say, I like the sequel more than the original here. I feel like they had a lot more to do, as if the first took all its time to set up the world, and the second actually got to tell a story inside of it. Okay, last but not least, we have Next Avengers, Heroes of Tomorrow. So the premise of this Avengers movie is simple. The Avengers paired up, had a bunch of kids, children, offspring, but Ultron took over the world. The children went into hiding. Through a strange turn of events, those kids would have to come together to form the next generation of the Avengers. Oh, Hulk's in this one as well. I have to say the movie is really easy to like. It's family friendly, sure, but it still has the structure that makes a good story. For one, I noticed how our heroes were active participants in the story. Things aren't happening to them, they were the catalyst that unfolded the events of the film. Whether it's waking up a robot or alerting Ultron to their whereabouts, the children here feel like active participants in this adventure.
Are you, online?
Iron Avenger. Designation, Captain America. Now online.
The movie has a unique perspective. Framing the story through the eyes of children, having them hear about Earth's mightiest heroes makes their parents seem all that more heroic. This also works for Ultron. Through the eyes of children, Ultron looks terrifying and his dread is really felt. Out of all of the Ultrons we've been given over the years, I still feel like the EMH Ultron was the best character, but this Ultron had the best lines.
You must realize, the end is here.
I don't know if this would have been too intense to see, especially considering the somewhat playful tone of the movie, but I personally would have liked to have seen a scene where the Avengers fell, like a flashback, have the kids see the footage of their parents being defeated. I feel like this would have made our heroes that much more invested in avenging their parents, in defeating Ultron. The closest we get to a scene like that shows the effects of Ultron, is when the kids see the remnants of their parents' outfits, which in my opinion just doesn't hold the same weight as the kids seeing their parents fall firsthand. Next Avengers is a perfectly fine movie. There are some scenes that feel off, as if they're missing a few moments that make the group feel less like friends and more like family. The action isn't anything too impressive and the voice talent is serviceable, but the menacing villain and the concept alone of seeing the next generation of the Avengers is enough to get you through any slow bits. Now, I was going to touch on the Hulk versus movies, but because they're only roughly half an hour apiece, I really don't think it's worth it. For those that want to know what I thought, without going into too much detail, well, I think the stunning action is enough to get you through a short with seemingly little to no story. That goes for both of them. The crown jewel of each short film is the battle sequence, so that should really tell you where their priorities were when creating these. Okay, so what's the inherent problem with these movies? Why are they compared to the DC animated movies as being worse or just trash? Why have they shed so much criticism? Well, I think it's quite obvious. In every movie, the runtime seems to be the problem. In every movie but Planet Hulk, the supporting characters feel like tools, plot devices, not characters. The runtime also affects how much we get to dive into the world building, how real this world feels that our heroes inhabit. I think the other issue with these movies is a lack of vision on the director's behalf. This is sort of a nuanced problem, but deep down, we as artists have an ability to just know what feels right story-wise. For some reason, McDuffie, Montgomery, and Vietti could read the heart of a story a mile away and understand how to create a great sequence around that core idea. What we see is a bunch of writers and directors that want to push these characters into no-win scenarios that require them to use their heart over their head, to make hard decisions, and that equates to great storytelling. From the final showdown in Under the Red Hood, or Crisis, or the final clashes between good versus evil in Wonder Woman, First Flight, or Doom. These climaxes feel earned and the heart of the story feels there. For some reason, however, in stories like Bad Blood, Batman vs Robin, Justice League War, and Dark, or Hell to Pay, it just feels empty. The final showdowns, the stakes, the emotions films just don't feel as intense as the older DC animated movies. As for the Marvel animated movies, I think that explains why they just feel a little more flat and a lot less epic than the first few DC animated movies. But as I've explained, the people making the Marvel animated movies are now making the DC ones, so who cares anymore, am I right? I think I've said everything I wanted to say on these movies. They're not bad by any means, most have a few standout scenes, and some are really great. What hinders them is the constraints they fall under, their budget, their runtime, and the creative forces behind them, the vision for these movies. If Marvel ever do bring back their animated movies, I'd love to see stories like House of M, The Children's Crusade, Infinity, or Annihilation adapted into hour-and-a-half long animated epics, or even adapting Hickman's run on the Fantastic Four, or maybe even Secret Wars, if you did a two-parter, who knows. Seeing as we're getting a What If animated series, I doubt we'll be seeing Marvel move their efforts back into animation anytime soon beyond that series. So with that being said, I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at the Marvel animated movies. Feel free to leave me your thoughts on the movies below. With that being said, be sure to like the video, it really helps me out, and yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Ciao.